talking about the Philippine Commonwealth and the occupation of Japan.
But before that, we'd love to introduce ourselves first. I am Clarence Keith Calipo.
I'm Micaela Shireen D. Formoso.
And I'm Maria Aureline Bagasco Cacho.
And we are Group 3.
Let us define first Commonwealth. Commonwealth is a political community founded on law and united by compact or tacit agreements of the people for the common good. The Commonwealth of the Philippines, or Commonwealth ng Pilipinas, was the administrative body that governed the Philippines from 1935 to 1946. The Commonwealth was designed as a transitional administration in preparation for the country's full achievement of independence. The Philippine Commission, year 1899 to 1916. The Philippine Commission was the name of two bodies, both appointed by the President of the United States to assist with governing the Philippines. In 1899, during the American occupation of the Philippines, United States President William McKinley appointed a commission led by Dr. Jacob Sherman to study and investigate the conditions in the Philippine Islands. This was known as the First Philippine Commission. The Second Philippine Commission, also known as the Taft Commission, was a body appointed by the President to exercise legislative and limited executive powers in the Philippines. It was first appointed by President McKinley in 1900 under his executive authority. The Philippine Bill of 1902, also known as Cooper Act, was the first organic law for the Philippines, sponsored by United States Congressman Henry Allen Cooper. By virtue of the U.S. Congress enactment of the Philippine Organic Act of 1902, the Philippine Legislature was formed. The Philippine Commission, which constituted the upper house, while the newly formed Philippine Assembly constituted the lower house.
To further train the Filipinos in the art of government, the U.S. Congress enacted the Jones Law on August 29, 1916. It was the first official document that clearly promised the Philippine independence. It replaced the Philippine Bill of 1902 as the framework of the Philippine government. This led to the creation of an all-Filipino legislature composed of the Philippine Senate and House of Representatives. On March 17, 1919, the Philippine legislature passed the famous Declaration of Purposes, which stated the inflexible desire of the Filipino people to be free and sovereign. The Osrock's mission in 1931 was a campaign for self-government and United States recognition of the independence of the Philippines, led by former Senate President Sergio Osmeña and House Speaker Manuel Rojas. It was the 9th independence mission which secured the Hare-Hawes-Cutting Act. The Hare-Hawes-Cutting Act was authored by South Carolina Representative Butler Hare, Missouri Senator Harry Barlow Hawes, and New Mexico Senator Bronson M. Cutting. It was finally passed by the United States Congress in December 1932, but was vetoed by U.S. President Herbert Hoover. Congress then overrode the veto on January 17, 1933. The first law setting a specific date for the Philippine independence from the United States is the Hare-Hawes-Cutting Act in 1933. The law promised Philippine independence after a 10-year transition period, but reserved several military and naval bases for the United States, as well as imposing tariffs and quotas on Philippine exports. Philippine Senate President Manuel L. Quezon led a mission to the U.S. opposing the new law and advocated for the passage of the Tidings-McDuffie Act. The Tidings-McDuffie, or the Philippine Independence Act, provided for a 10-year transition period preparatory to the grant of independence. Some powers of supervision were reserved to the United States, as well as foreign diplomacy and currency. In all other respects, the Philippines became self-governing. The organization of constitutional convention that would draw up the fundamental law of the land based on the American model was one of the salient provisions of the Tidings-McDuffie Act. Delegates to the convention were subsequently elected in 1934. In the first meeting held on July 30 at the session of the House of Representatives, Claro M. Recto was unanimously elected as its president. Debates on bicameralism and unicameralism. The greatest flight in the convention was the debate on whether the Constitution should provide for a unicameral or bicameral Congress. The bicameralists outnumbered the unicameralists in the convention, but they were torn on the method of electing members of the Senate. In the end, due to the indecisiveness of the bicameralists, the unicameralists won by a slim vote. The convention finished its work on February 8, 1935, and it was subsequently ratified by the Filipino people in a plebiscite on May 14, 1935.
The 1935 Constitution provided the legal basis of the Commonwealth government, which was considered a transition government before the granting of the Philippine independence with American-inspired Constitution. The Philippine government would eventually pattern its government system after American government. It had been said that the 1935 Constitution was the best written Philippine charter ever. Unicameral Congress of the Commonwealth, 1935 to 1941. By virtue of the 1935 Constitution, Senate President Manuel L. Quezon and his running mate, Senate President Sergio Osmeña, were elected as President and Vice President. The Constitution of the Commonwealth of the Philippines provided for a presidential system of government with a unicameral legislature. It had the power to enact laws for the Philippines, known as Commonwealth Acts, through the National Assembly. Restoration of the Senate in the Commonwealth, 1941. After 6 years under a unicameral legislature, the Constitution of the 1935 was amended, restoring the Senate of the Philippines and the House of Representatives, with a Senate President and the Speaker of the House leading the respective chambers. The judicial power was vested in one Supreme Court, but the National Assembly enacted Commonwealth Act No. 3, creating the Court of Appeals to relieve the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court during the Commonwealth. Following the ratification of the 1935 Philippine Constitution in a plebiscite, the principle of separation of power was adopted not by express and specific provision to that effect, but by actual division of powers of the government, executive, legislative, and judicial, in different articles thereof. As in the United States, the judicial power was vested by the 1935 Constitution in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as may be established by law. It devolved on the judiciary to determine whether the acts of the other two departments were in harmony with the fundamental law. The court during the Commonwealth was composed of a Chief Justice and 10 Associate Justices, and may sit en banc or in two divisions, unless otherwise provided by law. A hiatus in the Commonwealth period occurred when the Japanese imperial forces occupied the Philippines for 3 agonizing years, more specifically from January 3, 1942 to February 27, 1945, after the Americans successfully liberated the island. On December 8, 1941, Japan invaded the Philippines. Clark Air Base in Pampanga and Nichols Field outside Manila was attacked. On December 22, 1941, the Japanese forces landed at the Lingayen Gulf and continued on to Manila. On December 25, 1941, General Douglas MacArthur declared Manila an open city, on the advice of Commonwealth President Manuel L. Quezon to avoid its destruction. January 2, 1942, Japanese occupied Manila. April 9, 1942, U.S. and Filipino dependents in Bataan surrendered to the Japanese. MacArthur retreated with his troops to Bataan while Commonwealth government withdrew to Corregidor Island before proceeding to the United States. 76,000 captured soldiers were forced to embark on the death march to a prison camp at Capas Tarlac. An estimate of 10,000 prisoners died due to thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. Remaining Filipino and American soldiers resisted. Corregidor falls on May 6, 1942. Japanese military occupation begins.
In the midst of fear and chaos, farmers of Pampanga banded together and created local brigades for their protection. Luis Taruc, Juan Fileo, Castro Alejandrino, and other leaders of organized farmers held a meeting in February 1942 in Cabiao, Nueva Ecija. In that meeting, they agreed to fight the Japanese as a unified guerrilla army. They agreed to call their organization Hukbo ng Bayan Laban sa Mga Hapon, or Hukbalahap. Taruc was chosen to be the leader of the group, with Alejandrino as his right-hand man. The members were simply known as Hooks. The return to unicameralism under Japanese occupation, year 1942 to 1945. The Second Philippine Republic was established during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. The Commonwealth government went into the exile to the United States while the Japanese controlled the country through the Japanese Military Administration and the Philippine Executive Commission of several pre-war Filipino political leaders. The Philippine Executive Commission, in accordance with the instructions of President Manuel Quezon to George Vargas, the Filipino officials in Manila were told to enter into agreements and compromises with the Japanese to mitigate the sufferings of the people under the ironclad rule of the Japanese. The following month, an election was held for members of the Preparatory Commission for Philippine Independence, or PCPI. The purpose of PCPI is to draw up a constitution for a free Philippines. Jose Laurel became its head. Against the will of the PCPI, delegates, the new constitution was finalized on July 10, 1943. Kali Bapi. 2 months later, it was ratified by the Kali Bapi, which was the only political party allowed to exist at the time. Kali Bapi is the acronym for Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas. The new constitution noticeably lacked a Bill of Rights, contained 12 articles lifted from the 1935 Constitution that fitted the wishes of the Japanese, and was meant to be in effect only temporarily while the Philippines is still in chaos. Jose P. Laurel was elected as President of the Second Republic. The First Republic was Aguinaldo's Malolos Republic, and both Benigno Aquino Sr. and Ramon Avancena as a Vice President.
The Second Republic, with the promised independence of Premier Hideki Toho to the Philippines on June 16, 1943, the Japanese-sponsored Second Republic was inaugurated on October 14 of the same year on the front steps of the Legislative Building in Manila. The Philippine flag was hoisted as the national anthem was played. Jose P. Laurel was elected as President of the Second Republic and both Benigno Aquino Sr. and Ramon Avancena as Vice Presidents. The executive power was ostensibly held by Jose P. Laurel, and the legislative power in the Japanese-sponsored Executive Commission, which restored the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the Courts of First Instance, and the Municipal and Justice of the Peace Courts. The Second Republic followed the newly crafted 1943 Constitution and reverted the legislature back to a unicameral National Assembly, abolishing the bicameral structure. General MacArthur returns. MacArthur landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944. The arrival of the Allied forces in 1944 liberated the Philippines from the Imperial Japanese forces by 1945. Promise of Independence. On July 4, 1946, the Philippines was granted independence. Bell Trade Act was passed. U.S. still has access to Philippine resources. U.S. bases still remain in the Philippines.
That concludes our report.
Thank you so much for watching. Bye!